the man who fed the birds. Nobody in the city seemed to know his real name anymore. To most people, he was simply the man in the square. Every morning before sunrise, long before cafes opened or traffic filled the streets, he arrived carrying 2 old canvas bags filled with birdseed. He wore the same charcoal coat every winter, the same weathered boots, the same knitted scarf wrapped carefully around his neck, no matter the season. Then, without speaking much to anyone, he fed the birds. Hundreds of them. Pigeons gathered around him first, then sparrows, finches, even crows that perched nearby watching him with cautious intelligence. Tourists occasionally stopped to take photographs. Office workers hurried past without paying attention. Some people smiled at him. Others quietly judged him. But the old man never seemed bothered by any of it. He simply fed the birds. Every single morning. Elias first noticed him during the worst year of his life. At 37 years old, Elias felt as though his entire world had quietly collapsed while nobody noticed. The architecture firm he had worked at for 12 years downsized unexpectedly. His position disappeared with a short meeting and a handshake that felt painfully rehearsed. 3 months later, the relationship he thought would become a marriage ended over coffee and silence. "You haven't been yourself for a long time," she told him gently. The painful part was knowing she was right. After that, the days blurred together. Applications, interviews, rejections, sleepless nights staring at ceilings while anxiety tightened around his chest, like ropes pulling tighter each week. Friends stopped calling as often. Not because they were cruel, because adulthood has a strange way of scattering people into separate storms. Elias rented a small apartment overlooking an alley behind a grocery store. The radiator barely worked. Pipes rattled through the walls at night. Some evenings he sat in darkness simply to avoid thinking about bills. He stopped drawing. That was perhaps the saddest part. As a child, Elias had sketched constantly. Buildings, faces, street corners, entire imagined worlds. Drawing had once made him feel alive. But somewhere between deadlines, expectations, and survival, he abandoned it without even realizing. One freezing January morning, unable to sleep again, Elias wandered through the city before sunrise. That was when he first saw the old man feeding the birds. The square itself was beautiful in winter. Fresh snow rested softly on benches and statues. Steam drifted from nearby subway grates. Streetlights reflected gold across icy pavement. And there, standing quietly in the center of it all, was the old man. Birds surrounded him fearlessly. Not chaotic, not desperate, peaceful, as though they trusted him completely. Elias watched from a distance for several minutes before finally approaching. "Why do you do this every day?" he asked. The old man looked up slowly. His face was deeply lined with age, but his eyes carried an unusual calmness. "They still get hungry every morning," he replied simply. Then he returned to feeding the birds. Elias almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the answer felt strangely profound in its simplicity. The next morning, Elias returned. And the morning after that. At first, they barely spoke. Sometimes they stood together in silence while snow drifted through the square. Sometimes the old man shared small pieces of bread with him while the city slowly awakened around them. Weeks passed before Elias finally asked his name. "Samuel," the old man answered. "Do you live nearby?" Samuel smiled faintly. "Close enough." That was all he offered. Yet somehow, Elias kept returning. There was something calming about Samuel's presence. He never seemed rushed, never angry, never interested in impressing anyone. In a city filled with people desperately trying to become something, Samuel seemed entirely content simply being himself. One morning, Elias confessed something unexpectedly. "I feel like I failed at life." Samuel scattered seed across the snowy pavement before answering. "Most people think failure is losing money, relationships, or status," he said quietly. He nodded toward the birds gathering around them. "But real failure is losing yourself." Those words stayed with Elias long after he returned home. Over time, their conversations deepened. Samuel never gave dramatic speeches or motivational advice. Instead, he spoke in small truths. About loneliness, about grief, about how modern life teaches people to measure their worth through productivity while quietly draining the joy out of them. Some mornings they talked about fear. Other mornings, they simply watched the sunrise paint the buildings gold. Elias learned that Samuel had once been a music teacher decades earlier. He had been married once too. His wife had passed away many years ago after a long illness. "Didn't you feel angry afterward?" Elias asked one morning. Samuel thought carefully before answering. "Of course," he admitted. "I was angry at life. Angry at time. Angry at how quickly everything disappears." The birds fluttered gently around his boots. "But eventually I realized grief is just love with nowhere to go." Elias looked at him quietly after that. No one had ever explained loss that way before. Spring slowly replaced winter. The city softened. Trees budded green again. Street musicians returned to the sidewalks. And somehow, without fully noticing when it happened, Elias began changing too. He started sketching again. At first, only small drawings in cheap notebooks. The square. The birds. Samuel sitting beneath the early morning light. Then entire buildings. Parks. Faces on the subway. For the first time in years, creating no longer felt tied to success or achievement. It simply felt meaningful. One afternoon, Elias gathered enough courage to show Samuel his sketchbook. The old man turned each page slowly and carefully. "These are beautiful," he said. Elias laughed softly. "They're just drawings." Samuel looked directly at him. "No," he said gently. "They are proof you're becoming alive again." Months later, Elias found freelance work illustrating designs for a small publishing company. The pay wasn't remarkable, but for the first time in years, he no longer dreaded waking up. One evening after heavy rain, Elias arrived at the square to find it empty. No birds. No Samuel. Just wet pavement glistening beneath gray skies. The next morning, Samuel still didn't appear, nor the morning after that. Worry settled heavily inside him. Finally, the owner of a nearby cafe recognized Elias and quietly explained that Samuel had been taken to the hospital several days earlier. "He's very old," she said softly. Elias visited that evening. Samuel looked smaller in the hospital bed somehow. Fragile, but his eyes still carried the same peaceful warmth. "You came," Samuel whispered. "Of course I came." For a while they simply sat together listening to the distant sounds of hospital machines and footsteps in the hallway. Then Samuel smiled faintly. "You know," he said quietly, "people think inspiration comes from extraordinary people." Elias listened carefully. "But usually it comes from ordinary people who refuse to let life make them cruel." Tears burned unexpectedly behind Elias's eyes. Samuel noticed. "Promise me something," the old man said. "What?" "When life becomes difficult again." He smiled weakly. "Remain soft." Several days later, Samuel passed away peacefully in his sleep. The city continued moving as cities always do. Traffic lights changed. People rushed to work. Rain fell. Seasons shifted. But something inside Elias had changed permanently. Months later, people began noticing a younger man in the square every morning before sunrise. He carried 2 old canvas bags filled with birdseed. He wore a charcoal coat during winter. And while feeding the birds, he often sat sketching quietly beneath the morning light. Tourists still passed by without noticing. Office workers still hurried through the square distracted by busy lives. But occasionally someone struggling would stop nearby for a moment. And Elias would smile gently at them the same way Samuel once smiled at him. Because inspiration rarely arrives as lightning. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of a patient stranger. A simple conversation. A peaceful presence. A reminder that even after heartbreak, exhaustion, loneliness, and loss, there are still gentle souls in this world teaching others how to live. Not through perfection, but through kindness, through quiet consistency, through the simple courage of remaining warm in a cold world. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and follow.